Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar from NQA on the journey to carbon verification. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I'm Stephen Burt, I'm the Carbon and Sustainability Services Director here at NQA. This is the first of a three-part webinar series covering the full journey to carbon verification. I guess this might take around 40-45 minutes or thereabouts. As I mentioned, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars charting the journey to carbon verification. Today, we're going to look at part 1. Today will just be very high level introduction, overview and context to the carbon quantification process. We'll look at some of the drivers around it as well, regulatory drivers, supply chain drivers, competitive drivers and so on. And we'll also do an introduction around the options that you have for standards relating to carbon quantification, mitigation and reporting as well, and some of the other methodologies that you might be able to use. So quantification methodologies and some other non-international standards that might be options for you. So we'll be able to get that covered today. Part 2 of the webinar series will undertake on the 22nd of August, and that one will cover the actual process of getting started on your greenhouse gas reporting. So we'll look at that one, defining your organisational and reporting boundaries, selecting the most appropriate standard and methodology to use. We'll look at the different conversion factors, different carbon conversion factors that are available for your use, how to go about establishing baselines, and then the actual calculation process itself. So calculating your greenhouse gas emissions, 9 times out of 10, those are categorized as scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions, scope 2 emissions are your energy indirect emissions, and scope 3 emissions are generally your supply chain related emissions. And then we'll look at pulling all that together into a greenhouse gas inventory, and we'll have a think about materiality, in other words, percentage margins for error within the calculations itself. So that will be part 2 on the 22nd of August. Part 3 we'll do on the 13th of September, and that will look more closely at greenhouse gas mitigation techniques and options, the reporting requirements from the standards that you decide to choose, and also carbon removal and carbon offset options. So we'll cover specifically their planning for the reductions, the options that you have for carbon removals and carbon offsets and the pros and cons around those. We'll look at the documentation requirements of some of the standards, including preparing your greenhouse gas report. And lastly, we will look at the verification options, so the external third-party accredited verification options that you have. And I'll be able to take you through some of the case studies from clients that have been with NQA for that process. So all 3 of these webinars will take place at 2 p.m. on these days. We'll record all of them as well, so you'll have you'll be able to access the recordings if you were to miss any of them. So just a quick word about NQA first. So NQA is a global certification and verification body, certification for management systems, verification for carbon verification services. We operate globally. We've got sites all over the world, or offices all over the world, but certainly in the UK, we're the 3rd biggest certification body. We offer services around various carbon verification standards and various management system standards, some of which are related to sustainability as well within those social and for example, sustainable events management systems, as well as some that you might be more familiar with: quality, environmental, health and safety, information security, energy management systems, and lots of others as well. So I'm Stephen Burt, as I mentioned. I'm the Carbon Sustainability Services Director here at NQA, and between myself and my colleague Amber, who's a Sustainability Assurance Manager, we run the Sustainability Business Unit at NQA. And we've got a team, a growing team of lead greenhouse gas verifiers and lead sustainability assessors who are able to help with the certification and the verification processes that you might need. Just a quick overview of our ESG services, our environmental, social and governance services. We align those with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and it just gives a nice summary of how we align the different products and the different services that we're able to offer against each of those UN SDGs. So to make a start then, so the learning objectives for this session, part 1 in the series of 3, will really look to gain a high level overview of the context around carbon quantification, mitigation and reporting. So we're not going to get into a great level of detail in this session around how to go about doing it, but we'll look at the overall context. We'll also gain an overview of the drivers for carbon quantification, mitigation, reporting. So, you know, there's various drivers, various pressures, including regulations, legislation, which might be encouraging or, you know, pushing your business towards thinking about this. And lastly, we'll aim to understand the options that you have for using the different standards and the different methodologies to be able to actually undertake the process itself. So if we cover the context and introduction first, and as I said, this will be at a very high level, but it's important first to understand that, you know, we use the term carbon and we use the term GHG or greenhouse gas more or less interdependently. So greenhouse gases, I'll refer to those as GHGs throughout this process. And although people don't tend to use the term the greenhouse effect very often these days, it's quite important to understand the chemistry of the process that's involved. So, you know, greenhouse gases occur naturally. They also occur as a direct result of human activities, and the accumulation of those gases within the atmosphere essentially just trap the heat, the radiative heat from the sun, which would otherwise be reflected back out into space. And because the heat is trapped by those gases, the naturally occurring ones as well as the human ones, and some of that's necessary for life, of course. But because those are the heat's being trapped in increasing quantities, that essentially is leading to the issue of global warming and the issue of climate change itself. So the actual greenhouse gases that we need to think about themselves, so those are defined within what's called the Kyoto Protocol, and it defines 7 different greenhouse gases which contribute the most overall and arise as a result of human activities. And the table there shows what those greenhouse gases are. So we have carbon dioxide, which I'm sure we're all familiar with when we discuss these things, but we need also to be aware that methane, nitrous oxides, HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, PFCs, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride. Those are also greenhouse gases as well as carbon dioxide. And we can see what the origin of those gases are. So carbon dioxide predominantly comes from the combustion of fossil fuels in our businesses, in our boilers, in our cars, in our handling plant and equipment and so on. Methane largely comes from farming activities, agricultural activities, as does nitrous oxides. When we get to the HFCs and the PFCs, those are primarily emitted from air conditioning systems and HVAC systems, heating, ventilation and air conditioning systems. And sulfur hexafluoride and nitrogen trifluoride primarily come from fairly limited specialist industries around electrical equipment, for example, also aluminium manufacture and visual display screen production. Most businesses will be involved with or will result in the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide. So those of you using cooling systems, chillers, aircon systems may have emissions of HFCs in particular. Unless you're in specific industries, it's unlikely that sulfur hexafluoride or nitrogen trifluoride would be emitted as a result of the businesses that you undertake. Each of these gases is then assigned what's called a global warming potential, or a GWP. And the purpose of a GWP, or global warming potential, is to allow essentially the comparisons of the potency of the different greenhouse gases in terms of creating the greenhouse gas effect and therefore climate change. So that potency varies. It varies depending on the gas. It varies depending on the lifespan of that gas within the atmosphere itself. But to make life easy, the global warming potential, what that allows us to do is compare all of the greenhouse gases within the Kyoto Protocol against a single unit of measurement, which is 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So the GWP provides us with a relative measure. And the higher the global warming potential, the more that a given gas warms the Earth compared or relative to CO2 over the same time period. So what this allows us to do is report all of our greenhouse gases in an equivalent figure. That equivalent figure is tons of CO2e, or tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So the use of the term tons of CO2e is something that we convert all of our greenhouse gas emissions into, and that's a standard unit that all companies report in. You can see the different global warming potentials there. So carbon dioxide is given a value of 1, and relative to that, methane is 25 times more potent. For example, nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent, and the potency of the other 4 gases, or other 4 gases there, are huge compared to carbon dioxide. However, the percentage of the gases in the atmosphere themselves, carbon dioxide is by far and away the most prevalent of those gases, and that's the reason why that particular gas is used as the relative measure using the global warming potential to allow us to report using the unit of tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then we can think about the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well. This is data that's taken from NASA, and it shows essentially the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere of the Earth from 800,000 years ago right up until today. So the data up until 1958 is drawn from ice core data, so taking ice from deep in frozen areas of the Earth and analysing what the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was at that point. And then we can see from 1958 we actually have standardised instrumental data on global carbon dioxide concentrations, and you can really see the big leap there since 1911 in particular, and the graph on the right shows the direct measurements and the increase. So since 1958, when the actual instrumental data has been available, we can see a continual increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So really up until about 1911, we've got data which shows more or less the natural, not quite 1911 before that, but it shows more or less the natural carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And then from about 1911 in this particular chart, we've got data that shows what the human impact of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is. And as of today, the NASA website shows that the concentration is 427 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So what does that mean for global temperatures? Well, the graph here shows global average temperature 1850 to 2019 in this case. Some of the points there have got 95% confidence intervals. But what this means is that the United Nations, the members of the United Nations, via the Paris Agreement, have decided and agreed upon a high-level overarching goal to try to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit that temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So some of you might have established what's called science-based targets, and those science-based targets and the path to net zero that's developed by those science-based targets, that is the science that those are based upon. It's the efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. So we can see overall the chart demonstrates quite well that the overall global average temperature has been increasing quite significantly, and arguably that's as a result of the human related emissions of the greenhouse gases that we discussed earlier. So how's the UK performing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, the data is available from, or the good quality data is available from 1990, really. And we can see the contribution, and we can also see the patterns that emerge for each of the different sectors within the UK economy. So energy supply, in other words, generating our electricity, has fallen very, very rapidly since 1990 in the UK, because we no longer have, we do have some, but very few oil-fired power stations, for example. There's no more coal-fired power stations. The gas-fired power stations we've got are much more efficient than they were, and obviously we have a much, much higher percentage of our electricity being generated through renewable generation techniques. So that's why that's dropped so significantly. However, transport hasn't dropped half as quickly, nor has business or residential or agriculture. We've seen some big improvements in waste management, and again, that's a direct result of national waste strategies in the early 2000s, when things like organic waste in landfills were sent for composting instead of landfill, and various other recycling efforts and waste management techniques. And we can also see some of the impacts of both the recession in 2008, and we can also see some of the impacts of COVID around 2020 in that graph as well. So we've set the context and had a look at greenhouse gases and the general direction that things are moving in. So why is greenhouse gas reporting important then? So scientists agree that the most critical issue facing the planet is climate change. Because of that and various international agreements, the UK government has a statutory net zero commitment by 2050. So as part of that, it involves limiting the global temperature increase in keeping with the science-based targets. All of that's laid out in the UK government net zero strategy, and that was revised actually in 2023 to the UK government carbon budget delivery plan. This obviously has a knock-on effect to us in our houses, us in our cars, but also your businesses, organisations and companies. The drivers around decarbonisation are becoming more and more prevalent. So those drivers, to a lesser extent for most companies, for very large companies it's maybe a higher extent, but on the whole, to a lesser extent, various regulatory and policy changes which are laid out in the UK government's carbon budget delivery plan are driving it. And to a much greater extent, certainly in my experience anyway, supply chain pressures and stakeholder expectations are the greater of the drivers around the pressures on businesses to firstly quantify and then reduce and then report their carbon emissions. So that in itself is all leading to many companies making public commitments around net zero. So progress in the UK, really so far so good, although it some may say it's stalled slightly in more recent years, but overall, the UK government has established 6 carbon budgets, so 6 periods against which they will monitor and report carbon. Carbon budgets 1, 2, and 3 ran from 2008 to 2022, and all of those have been reported as having been achieved and also exceeded as well in terms of the reductions. From the projected baselines, the government's produced what they call EEPs, energy and emission projections, against each of the following carbon budget periods, and those indicate as follows. So carbon budget 4 will run from 2023 to 2027, and the data, the projections, the energy and emissions projections indicate that that carbon budget period will be achieved, the necessary reductions will take place. And then carbon budget 5, which is from 2028 to 2032, the current projections indicate a relatively small shortfall in that, but time is still on our side, of course. And then carbon budget 6, which will run from 2033 to 2037, indicates really at the minute the projections still show a very significant shortfall against that budget, and that budget period begins to rely much more on the actual removals of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere by that point, as well as the reductions which have been so successful to date. So the removals will be both engineered, in other words technological, and nature-based removal mechanisms to actually remove the carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere itself. So we have in the UK up until carbon budget 6 at the minute, and carbon budget 7 and so on will be developed thereafter to take us to the ultimate goal of net zero by 2050. So far so good really in the UK, I think. So why is greenhouse gas reporting important? So if you can't measure it as accurately as possible, then you probably can't manage it. So there's various issues, or various standards and protocols and conversion factors that we're able to use to help us to measure it. And that's largely where the greenhouse gas reporting mechanisms come in. So the issues, however, with the methodologies used to quantify greenhouse gas emissions, it's fair to say I've kind of worked all over the world on carbon reporting and carbon verification over my career, and my opinion is that in the UK we've got one of the best, if not the best, set of carbon conversion factors in the world. So we're very lucky. We've got the tools that we need as business people to be able to quantify our carbon very effectively in this country, and even some what you might consider to be forward thinking countries, Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, for example. Again, in my opinion, in the UK, we've got a better set of data to work with. So we're very fortunate in that regard. We've also got the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to work with, full name Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard. That's a great tool to use. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail shortly. However, it does not yet provide for accounting for greenhouse gas removals. That's still at the pilot stage. Carbon offsetting as well for carbon neutrality is an issue. It attracts a lot of negative publicity, but there are standards available, international standards that prescribe how that should be undertaken, and the very best and most credible and robust mechanism for undertaking it. And then, of course, one company's scope 3 emissions are very often another company's scope 1 and 2 emissions. So there can be a risk of double counting of those supply chain greenhouse gas emissions in the scope 3s. And there's a risk also of carbon leakage, which is really offshoring operations to a less stringent regulatory environment, so that you don't account directly for the carbon emissions associated with your activities. And unfortunately, we also see some inventive and creative carbon accounting techniques going on. So all of this necessitates the need for the adoption of standardized international approaches to greenhouse gas quantification and reporting. So we have ISO standards, and we also have British standards, and we also have publicly available specifications, PAS documents, which are all there to lend themselves to the greenhouse gas quantification and reporting process. So we'll just quickly look at some of the drivers now around the pressures for quantifying your greenhouse gas emissions. You can really summarize these drivers under 4 headings, I think. So improved competitive advantage is a big one. In other words, supply chain pressures from your customers. Regulatory compliance is a growing area, largely impacts large companies at the minute, but as part of the government's net zero strategy, it will begin more and more to impact small to medium-sized companies as well. There's also, the question of risk reduction, including through supply chains. So reputational risks, for example, as well as financial risks. And we shouldn't forget that environmental improvement and long-term business sustainability is also one of the main drivers for carbon quantification. So we'll look at each of these in turn, one by one, and I'll be able to provide you with some examples of what that might look like. So in terms of an improved competitive advantage, you may already be experiencing this yourself. We do in NQA. So, we're a service provider. We don't make any products. We provide ISO certification and verification services. However, there's once a week or thereabouts, I will receive on my desk a customer questionnaire from some of our customers, or as part of a tender process, there'll be questions to answer around NQA's own carbon performance and data. So that's very often the case. The larger companies, the customers pressurizing their suppliers and their supply chain through tenders, contracts and questionnaires into providing the necessary carbon data. There's also, from a competitive advantage perspective, some greenhouse gas reporting required for the winning of major contracts. So you might have heard of Policy Procurement Note 0621, PPN 0621. We'll look at that in a second, and also a specification called PAS 2080, which we'll also look at in a second. All of these either arise from or result in supply chain pressures, which obviously, if you turn that on its head, it gives you the opportunity as a business to have an improved competitive advantage and win the contracts that your competitors might not be able to. So if we think about the first example, which is PPN 0621, so this is a UK government procurement policy note around carbon reduction plans when they procure major government contracts. So at the minute, any UK government contract valued over £5 million requires the supplier to provide a carbon management plan. It requires the supplier to detail how they're going to achieve net zero. It requires the supplier to quantify their scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. It requires a date for net zero, a target date, and it requires detail of the carbon reduction target. So any of you who might be supplying the NHS, or any of you who might be supplying the Ministry of Defence, may have experienced this as a supply chain pressure. PAS 2080 is really aimed at the construction industry overall, but not just construction or demolition companies, but also civil engineers and designers and product and material suppliers into the construction process. And PAS 2080, whilst it's a standalone publicly available specification which NQA can offer certification to, we've seen supply chain pressure. So for example, National Highways, who look after the road and highways networks, have made a public commitment. All of their contractors and their subcontractors are to implement their own PAS 2080 accredited carbon management system by the end of 2025. So this is a huge thing for the construction industry at the minute. At NQA, we're really being quite inundated with inquiries around this at the minute, but we're well placed to provide the service to those who need it. We also see supplier questionnaires coming from other sources as well, so not necessarily looking for you to achieve particular standards, but all looking for you to quantify your carbon. So this is just an example that I picked up. This is from a multinational aerospace, defence and transportation company. And they've sent this out to all their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, I think it is, and the customer in this case is expecting a response to these questions. So they're expecting scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions to be quantified. They're also asking the question of whether they've been subject to external third-party verification, such as NQA can provide, and also what the greenhouse gas emission allocation is to the particular products and services which the supplier is providing to this particular aerospace and defence and transportation company. And then it goes on to ask for detail around what the carbon reduction strategy is for the business. Have they set science-based targets, for example? So we can see supply chain pressures and the opportunity to turn those pressures on their head and turn that into a competitive advantage is a big part of the drivers around carbon quantification. The next main driver is regulatory compliance. So some of you may have felt the impact of the regulatory environment around carbon at the minute. And this is largely as a result of the UK's drive towards net zero. So those of you who are lucky enough to have an ESOS obligation, an energy saving and opportunity scheme obligation, and hopefully have submitted all your data into the ESOS system and are in full compliance, you'll have noticed that some of the questions this time around for phase 3, some of the reporting requirements involve carbon, and certainly for phase 4, the reporting requirements will be focused on net zero. So much more carbon reporting and net zero performance reporting will come along in ESOS phase 4. Excuse me. SECR reporting, many of you will be involved in generating carbon data for your annual director's report for the submission to Companies House. That's a relatively recent thing as well. Those of you in very big energy intensive industries may have a UK emission trading scheme obligation. And many of you might have entered into climate change levy agreements via your trade associations or your trade bodies in order to receive an 80% discount on the climate change levy. Oh, just oh, excuse me, I'm having a coughing fit here. Some of you might have a CSRD obligation if you supply into the EU, or a CBAM obligation if you supply into the if you supply into the EU. Sorry about this, I'm having a coughing fit. CBAM is a relatively new thing for the EU. It's essentially a carbon tax, whereby if you're supplying certain products and services into the EU, it's intended to balance the marketplace out, but it requires carbon embodied carbon quantification for your products themselves. So those are the regulatory drivers. And there's also risk reduction to think about as well. So greenhouse gas reporting impacts upon risk management, lots of stakeholders, financial investments, investors in your business, also insurers, and the need to think about risk reduction around negative publicity or reputational risks. So greenwashing is something that's also a primary driver for this as well. So we shouldn't forget that environmental improvement and long-term business sustainability is also one of the key drivers. So as consumers become more aware, as investors and other stakeholders become more aware, it becomes more important. And we shouldn't forget that, you know, the frequency of climate-related emergencies is likely to increase, and that often leads to supply chain disruption. But we should also note that it is possible to reduce carbon and to remain competitive. So if we use the UK as the example there, the UK has reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 42% since 1990, whilst at the same time the economy has grown by 2/3. So, you know, we shouldn't think of these things as mutually exclusive. It is possible to be carbon efficient and to remain economically competitive as well. So that's the last of the key drivers that we can look at. Next, we'll move on and we'll have a look at some of the options for standards, by which I mean, you know, documented international standards and some of the methodologies which you can use to help to quantify your carbon. And we'll look at these in more detail when we come to look at part 2 of this webinar series. So the first one we should think about is ISO 14064-1, which is the specification with guidance at the organisational level for the quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to battle on here. So this is obviously an ISO standard, so it's the highest tier. It gives us a framework for quantifying but not calculating our greenhouse gas emissions. It's intended for companies and organisations. It has an optional greenhouse gas mitigation framework, and crucially it allows for external third-party verification via verification bodies such as NQA, which gives you that credibility and assurance that's required. There's also international standards for demonstrating carbon neutrality. So ISO 14064-1 that we just looked at is the kind of first major step towards both of these standards. So PAS 2060 is being withdrawn actually, and it will be replaced by ISO 14068-1, which is the specification for carbon neutrality, the international ISO one. And again, NQA is able to provide accredited third-party verification against both of those standards as well. But as I said, ISO 14064-1 is a major stepping stone towards conformance with these particular standards. PAS 2080 we've already mentioned, so that's primarily for the construction industry, the value chain in the construction industry. And again, NQA is able to provide third-party verification against that specification. And then options for actually quantifying, for calculating your carbon emissions. So I'm sure you're aware of the UK government environmental reporting guidelines and the related carbon conversion factors. So these are the if not the best, that's certainly amongst the best set of carbon conversion factors in the world. Really comprehensive. They cover all the different scope 1, 2 and 3 activities that your business will undertake, and those are updated annually, usually around about March, April, May, June time. The UK government will publish the updated conversion factors for the previous calendar year. you can access those very easily. There's a web link there. The current set are there for 2024, actually. They've already published those ones, but most companies at the minute will be using the 2023 data set. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this is this document's been around since the 1990s, but in its current form, I think it's about 2001. And this gives us an excellent set of guidance on calculating scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. It doesn't provide conversion factors though, because it's an international document. Conversion factors, generally speaking, are country specific, especially for scope 2. But that's a great guidance document to use to structure your greenhouse gas reporting, your greenhouse gas inventory. And there are other sources of information. So, for example, EPDs, or environmental product declarations, often come with products that we can purchase, and they're based on a life cycle assessment of the particular products themselves. So the one that we can see there, for example, is for a building spray foam insulation, and these documents provide data on the carbon dioxide equivalent figure for the embodied carbon, in other words, the carbon that's been emitted as a result of the manufacturing process for that particular product. So EPDs are always a very good source of information when it comes to product-related greenhouse gas emissions and embodied carbon in products. If you're in the construction industry, the ICE database, the Inventory of Carbon and Energy database, is excellent. That's produced by RICS, and it's an embodied carbon database for construction materials. It's very, very useful for PAS 2080 purposes. And very occasionally we find a company which has activities for which there is no conversion factor, but often, you know, you can find peer-reviewed scientific papers which might provide at least some of the information that's needed to develop your own carbon conversion factor for those activities. Mostly that takes place in things like forestry and agriculture, though it's not something, you know, the previous ones we've looked at generally give all the conversion factors you need for industrial activities. And lastly, we can, you know, if we aren't able for whatever reason to fully evaluate line by line our greenhouse gas emissions from activity data, then we can fall back to use a spend-based approach. So DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, they publish greenhouse gas emission intensity data by industry, by SIC, by standard industrial classification codes, and they provide a carbon dioxide equivalent per pound figure, conversion factor, for each industry in the UK. So if you know how much money you spend purchasing goods and services from a particular industry, it is possible to do a carbon conversion using that data. Although it's not going to be as accurate as using the more accurate line-by-line conversion factors. And likewise, the Office for National Statistics produce something similar, although the DEFRA conversion factors by SIC code are actually more up to date and more accurate, in my opinion. Okay, good. Despite my coughing fits, we've managed to get through almost all of this. Next time, what we will look at is on the 22nd of August, We'll look at part 2 of this webinar, getting started in your GHG reporting. We'll get into the detail, the nitty-gritty of actually quantifying your carbon emissions in that particular webinar. Key to any carbon quantification process is defining exactly what it is that you're reporting, drawing a boundary around your own organisation and drawing a boundary around exactly what you're going to be reporting on. So we'll start with that. We'll look at which standards are best for which industries at that point, which conversion factors to use, the best baselines to use. So for example, at NQA, we have 2019 as our baseline. 2020, 21 and 22 were not normal years because of COVID. So we still, in 2024, measure our carbon and compare ourselves against our 2019 baseline, because it's comparing apples with apples rather than apples and pears. And we'll also look at calculating your scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions themselves, putting all that into a greenhouse gas inventory and then assessing materiality or error uncertainty levels. And then in part 3 on the 13th of September, we'll look at options for improvement, including reductions, carbon removals, carbon offsets, and then how to pull all that together into a greenhouse gas report to meet the requirements of the specific standard that you're using. And then lastly, we will look at verification options, and I can support that with some case studies as well. So just some sources of further support at NQA. If you look at the website, we have a sustainability microsite which has got lots of useful information on it in terms of carbon and wider sustainability services. And we also offer a range of courses as well, including greenhouse gas lead verifier courses, including carbon quantification courses and carbon awareness raising courses. And again, you can find that on the NQA website if that would be of interest. So that's us finished. My apologies for my coughing fits there. I think my entire family have had it, and I thought I got away with it until this afternoon. So clearly I didn't. So thanks very much.